welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast, your guide to help you manage life, money, and multiples. Each episode, host Paul Fenner, Tama Capital's president and founder, and the proud parent of 4 amazing children, including 1 set of triplets, will provide insights on successfully sustaining an active lifestyle, career, and family through comprehensive wealth management strategies, financial education, and lifestyle planning, specific to parents raising twins, triplets, and more. Learn more, subscribe to the show, or connect with Paul at tamacapital.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of TAMA may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Are you struggling to make decisions that will benefit your future self? Are you constantly prioritizing short-term gains over long-term success? Ann Wilson is a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and part of Laurier's social psychology program. Ann is fascinated by how people behave, think, and understand themselves and their social worlds, especially regarding how people make decisions. During our conversation, we explore the science behind motivation and decision-making for our long-term selves. We examine the concept of temporal discounting and how to combat it by making our future selves closer to our present selves. Ann also points out how to balance the need for distance and reflection to cope with trauma and negative experiences. Our memories and perception of time are malleable, and we discuss how to use this to our advantage to shift our mindset and accomplish our goals. We also discuss the strategies for parents to support their children's growth mindset and handling failures. Please enjoy my conversation with Ann Wilson. So, Ann Wilson, welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So where do we find you at today?
So I'm at, I'm at my home office right now, but I am at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is in Waterloo in Canada.
So where exactly is Waterloo, like outside of Toronto?
Yeah, it's about an hour from Toronto.
Okay. All right. Well, as we were talking before I hit record, I initially found your work through one of our prior guests, Jason Pfeiffer, at Entrepreneur Magazine or entrepreneur.com. And I was really taken back with your conversation with him about the work that you do in memory and future self and present self. And I just had a conversation with Hal Hirschfield at UCLA a few weeks ago. So I'm sure you're familiar with Hal and his work.
Yeah, actually, he just came to mind as I was thinking about some of the stuff we might chat about today.
Yeah, so he's coming out with his new book, The Future Self, in June. So he'll his show will get kind of released around then. But no, I'm looking forward to. It's a subject I'm really interested in learning more about. Especially from what I do as a financial advisor, and then the work I do as a parent. So, but why don't we start with you and your background? Can you let our audience know what kind of work you do and your background?
Sure. Well, I can say a little bit about like my background, where I came from. So I'm a first generation student. So first in my family to go to university. And when I started out going to university, I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do at all. I was really good in the hard sciences in high school. So I actually had a guidance counselor who told me that I owed it to women to go into hard sciences, right? Biology, chemistry, physics, that sort of thing. So that's what I signed up for. But over the first even couple of years of university, I found myself really excited about the electives and planning out the psychology and the sociology and the anthropology courses, those sorts of things. So I ended up switching majors to the social sciences. And it was when I first took social psychology. So I consider myself a social psychologist. I took my first course in my 3rd year, and that's really what hooked me. Is what's neat about social psychology is it allows you to use the systematic scientific method, but to study what I consider to be some of the most fascinating and complicated problems out there, right? About human behavior and thinking and emotion. So that's really what I've been doing since then. I also just want to really nod to the importance of mentorship because as a first generation student, I had no idea what was even possible. And it was really my professor who showed me the path and the things that I could possibly do with my life, right? So I went to grad school. Actually, I'm in Waterloo now, but I started, I've been in Waterloo since grad school. I went to the University of Waterloo, which is the bigger university down the street in this same town. And since then, I've really been studying how people think about themselves over time, how they think about their past, their memories, and how their memories are often pretty fallible. Fallible, that's a new word. So that's fallible and malleable put together.
That's a good one.
Yeah. And how they think about their future as well. When I was thinking about my lab now, so my lab is called Impetus Lab. And this is an acronym. A lot of us, we're all nerds, so we try to come up with, acronyms that represent what we do. So I sat down with a bunch of my students and we played around with different kinds of acronyms. And so what that stands for is identity, motivation, and perception extended in time and across society. So it's kind of a mouthful. But it stands for this idea of the stories that we tell about ourselves, about others, and even about the world more generally. So I look at this both for individuals, for relationships, as well as for like the society level. We have collective identities and we think about our nation's past and our nation's future and so on, right, as well. And so how we do that and the way that helps us to make meaning, how to find motivation, to chart a path forward. And just also to feel better about ourselves a lot of the time.
So you've already answered one of my questions, which was to explain what the Impetus Lab is and what you do there. I love acronyms. So as most listeners know, my firm TAMA was built off of the first letter of my wife and my kids' first name. So my wife is Teresa, Aiden, Madison, Mackenzie, and Andrew. So I always, and my story is like, when I tell that, I explain that, I'm always first to say, like, I did not come up with that. My career mentor, Camille Jane, did. And it's really stuck because that's who I mainly work with, are families, whether you have multiples like I do, or you just have multiple kids. It's really centered around family. And so, having, experts like you come on and talk about memories and how your work looks at what you do and choose today in decision making versus what you do or how you treat your future self. Mm-hmm. I think the point, where I would like to start is, going back to that conversation that you had with Jason Pfeiffer, is these stories that we tell ourselves and the memories that we have or think we have or make, how closely do those resemble the truth and what actually happened? I think the example that Jason gave, which was really cool, was, he decided to quit his job as a small town reporter because he wanted to, write for the Times or the Washington Post. And he knew that, if no one was going to come to him, he was going to have to go to them. And so the way he tells that story, it's like this great big adventure that he did. And then he's like, well, did it really happen that way? I'm like, yeah, I quit my job. Yeah, I did get that invite to do a freelance article for the Post, but did all that other stuff really happen?
Yeah, so that's a great example, I think, of what most of us do on a pretty regular basis, right? Is we tell these stories, we're sort of weaving tales about ourselves through time. And by doing that, we're both pulling some things from our real memory and also shaping those memories into something that might be a little different than what they were originally, right? So the very act of storytelling can sometimes actually change the way that we recall the past over time. And this can happen when we're just sort of developing a narrative of our own life story. Some people do this in a way where we're the main character in an adventure. We start off from, these kind of difficult routes, and then we move on to bigger and better things. And some people have like different, maybe sadder versions of a story. But the way that we tell that story can end up being kind of like a foundation for how we then end up thinking about what our future is going to look like. So one of the things that I could maybe highlight, if it's okay to step back one step too, is to just give you just like sort of a little brief primer on mental time travel more generally, like the science of
Yes, lay it on us, Anna.
These things, right? So if you think about ourselves through time, the only thing we have direct access to is the current moment, right? The present, just right now. Everything else we need to mentally time travel to get to. And, we haven't built a time machine yet, but our brains do a pretty good job of transporting us to the past and to the future. And theorists, I don't do comparative research with animals, but a lot of theorists who do say that, humans, one of the things that's really distinct about humans is our ability to mentally time travel in these really rich and nuanced ways to episodic memories of the past, right? Where we have a whole story of the past, not just like specific knowledge that we've gained, as well as a story about our future. And so the thing to remember, though, is that all of that mental time travel, past and future, is simulation. And what I mean by that is like we're making it up, right? We're constructing it to some degree. And we all kind of know that about the future, right? So the future is just by its nature, it's hypothetical. So we know that we're simulating that to some extent. And we don't often recognize that as much about the past. So sometimes we think about the past as though we're just sort of pulling a file out of our memory drawer, right? And then we replay the video, and that's what had happened initially. But that's really not the way memory works. So it works a lot more like that same constructive process of thinking about the future. You can think of it like an archaeologist piecing together a story of the past from little bits of artifact, right? So we're doing that with our own past all of the time. And so there's a lot of flexibility in there. And what's cool about that, you can call that fallibility, but you can also call that poetic license. And some theorists have suggested that some of that malleability, how elastic our memory is, that it might not be a bug. It might not be like a bad thing about our memory, but rather it's a feature. Because it turns out that the same parts of our brain that tend to reconstruct the past are also deeply involved in how we construct the future, right? And so it could be that the very fact that we tend to be very creative and flexible in how we remember the past also allows us to have the creativity and the flexibility in how we map on our future, right? So basically the same parts of our brain lights up. When we think about our past and when we think about our future, people who have amnesia have trouble thinking about future planning, right? So there seems to be a really deep connection between these two processes. And so that's, in a nutshell, what mental time travel is all based on, right? And then what I've studied in my lab starts from that basic insight that the past is really, really malleable. But then we've tried to look at like, what are the factors that end up causing us to sometimes remember the past as quite different than it really is. So one example of that is we often tend to remember the past as worse than it actually was. So we tend to kind of retrospectively downgrade the past, be more critical of our past self than we actually were at the time. And that seems to allow us, maybe in the same way that Jason's story suggested, to have this onward and upward kind of vision of ourselves over time, where we really imagine ourselves as continuing to get better and better into the future.
That's interesting, because I always thought that we saw our memories or history as better than what they were, not worse than what they were. And I just think of the term like the good old days. Like we were reminiscing about how good the past was when it maybe wasn't so good.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually that segues to another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit. So although we sometimes think about our pasts as worse than our present, right? Because we like to feel this sense of continuous improvement. There's also obviously some really positive memories that we cherish in the past. We have nostalgic kinds of experiences that we keep revisiting and so on. And so this actually is another thing that I've studied a lot in the lab, which is how do we manage both the good and the bad in our past in ways that help us to feel pretty coherent and integrated in the present, right? And so it's not just memory itself that can be malleable, but also our very sense of time. And I've been really fascinated by this idea of subjective time. So subjective time is easy, I think, for people to think about, to understand. Just, you can think about, most of us can think about a time that we know happened a long time ago, but it feels like yesterday, right?
Yes.
It might be a wonderful vacation. It could be our wedding, the birth of our children, something like that. And then there's also times where we know it didn't happen that long ago. So maybe it was, an embarrassing event or a failure that happened sometime in the last year, but that feels like ancient history to us, right? So subjectively, things can feel pretty close or far away, even when they actually happened around the same time in chronological time. And so this subjective sense of time is important because it allows us, in many cases, so psychologically healthy people often tend to push the negatives further psychologically into the past to allow them to have some emotional distance from those events. While at the same time, if you ask them how close positive events feel, they'll say, oh, those positive events feel pretty close, like yesterday, right? So that's the good old days. Those things still feel pretty vivid to us. And one of the nice things about that is that it allows us to keep dipping into all of those good things from our past and include them in our current sense of identity. But it can relegate some of the negatives to a different self, right? So we no longer include some of those negative events in our identity to the same degree.
Does that concept lend itself to not having an accurate picture of this time travel that we're in? And I guess more specifically, can that harm or hurt us either emotionally or mentally?
To sort of move our sense of time around, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, and one I only have a partial answer for. It's actually something we're continuing to grapple with in my lab. So on one hand, you could imagine that distancing negatives, right, like pushing things away, could be a bit of an avoidant tendency. Like maybe I don't want to face up to them. I don't want to acknowledge my mistakes and that sort of thing. That could keep you from learning from them. But on the other hand, when negatives are too close and too painful, that's often when emotionally we have the most desire to kind of protect ourselves, right? So it may actually be that there's a sweet spot somewhere in there, right? We don't want to just run away from negative events. We want to keep them close enough to be able to reflect on them and to learn and grow from them. But doing it in a way that allows us to get enough emotional distance that we aren't feeling like we just have to, crawl into a corner and hide. And so there are other researchers, actually. Ethan Kross is one of them that looks at this idea of psychological distance and different ways of doing that from, say, a clinical perspective to help people to cope with trauma. And imagining yourself almost like a fly on the wall, looking down at some memory or something like that, just to keep you from getting too immersed in the emotions of it, can be useful. So I think that, it's a complex question, but that's at least a part of an answer.
Yeah, when you were saying that, the first thing that I thought was, okay, well, this is where the cognitive therapists come into play and helping someone specifically sort through that. And especially like trauma is a big one. Because the one thing you've mentioned time and time again is the work that we do in the lab. Mm-hmm. So can you lift up the hood and explain to us, like, what exactly does a lab like yours do, and how does it work? Like, how do you get all this great research and then start formulating these into concepts or theories?
Yeah. So the approaches that we tend to take primarily are experimental approaches, which means that we try to hold as many things constant as possible and only subtly move around one or two things at a time, right? So we can actually look at the cause and effects of those things. And a lot of what we study is people's personal experiences of their memories or of their identities. So it means we can rely a fair bit on self-report. So a lot of times that means we're looking at doing questionnaires and asking people to think about the same point in the past, for example, or to remember some event and tell us a little bit about it, to describe an event from their own personal past, and then ask them systematically different kinds of questions about that, depending on how we want them to think about it. So we could, for example, make people feel really close or far away from a past event that happened. One way that we've done that is to give people a timeline. This is just a spatial timeline, right? So think about your time from birth to today, and then put that event on the timeline. And if we give people a timeline from birth to today, then an event, say from a year or two ago, actually looks pretty close to today, right? But you could also give people a timeline that only goes from, say, for students, age 16 to today, right? So say it's a timeline that goes 4 or 5 years. Then we say, okay, put that event on a timeline. And now suddenly the timeline is expanded, right? So it's from 16 to today, and the bad event happened when I was 17, right? So now the event looks really far away from today. I've placed it on the other end of the timeline. And so that's just like a tricky experimental manipulation approach to get people to temporarily feel like an event is either really close or really far away from today. And we find when people do that, they feel like that same memory is either pretty distant or pretty recent, and it has different emotional implications for the present. You can do other things too. So another example is to get people to recount the same story from an immersed first-person perspective, like, I am going through this again. This is how I'm feeling. Like, put yourself in the moment, talk about it in present tense, or to get people to recount that event from a third-person, more distanced perspective. So I see Anne in the picture, and she's going through these events, right? And that can also cause people to feel more close and immersed with that memory, or to feel more distant.
In a similar way that when we create these stories for ourselves, if I kind of try to tie this back to what I do as a financial advisor and helping people make financial decisions that are clearly tied to emotional decisions, does your work center on, or have you had any work that's focused on how people make decisions and the stories that they tell themselves to, either justify a decision or lead them down some path to help them make a decision that was both financial and emotional and together?
Oh, that's a good question. So I don't know if I can answer I don't know if I've got a study that gets at exactly that, but I'll tell you a little bit about how we've approached this question of making decisions for and pursuing goals for the future, right? And so I think about the past and the future as flip sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. And so a lot of the same things I've talked about, subjective time, the malleability of our visions, are similar for the past and for the future. So people are often motivated to make decisions now that are going to benefit their longer term selves, right? They are often motivated to pursue longer term goals, for example, maybe making financial decisions that mean taking a bit of a hit now, right? So maybe some sacrifice today because they know it's going to be good for their long term future. Could also mean, I want to skip a party I'd like to go to this weekend because I know I have a big project to finish, or I'm going to forgo Netflix because I want to get to the gym and get some exercise, right? So all of these are really, it's like this core human problem. And it's something called temporal discounting. And it's this idea that we tend to value things that are in our immediate future a lot more than things that are in our more distant future. So we tend to undervalue things that are more distant. And part of the reason for that is that those distant rewards, they're going to ourselves, but they're going to a self that doesn't quite feel like us, right? And this might make you think of some of the conversations you had with Hal Hirschfeld, actually. But so the idea is that if we're making a sacrifice today, it might feel like we're making that sacrifice almost like it's for a different person, for a stranger in the future. But because our sense of time is so malleable, that's something that we can also work with. And so one way that we can do that is to make those future selves feel closer and more continuous with the present self. One approach we've taken to doing that is by asking people to write a letter to their future self. And in one study, we actually got them to then put themselves in the shoes of their future self and write a letter back to their present self. So we did that with high school students, and that both made them feel more connected to this future self of a few years down the road. And it also made them more motivated to stay focused on their academics now, because that was going to connect to their future goals, right? Hal Hirschfeld has looked at one of my favorite studies that he and his colleagues have done. Look at, they take a picture of yourself today and then they age it, right?
Yes.
So virtually age it. And people are more likely to save money, I think, for retirement in that study, if they are face to face with, if they get to meet their older future self, right? So I think that that's another way that this flexibility in time travel can really work in our favor if we want to be making decisions that are good for us in the long run, even though there are sometimes roadblocks in the short run.
Yeah, that's a topic. It's funny you just said that, because I was just thinking that's, I think, one of the hardest things about having long-term goals is this issue of the messy middle, if you will. Ayelet Fishbach, who I had on the show, I think towards the end of last year, she wrote a book called Get It Done. And that was one of the areas that she really focused on was, especially with long-term goals, you see the benefit of saving for that future self, but it's when you're in the thick of it and in literally like in the middle, it's sometimes easier to forget that future self and do what you want to do today. Yeah. And so for long-term goals, that's where that and I'm forgetting exactly how she coined her phrase with that, but that medium term is what really can derail people.
Yeah, I've actually chatted with Ayelet Fishbach about exactly this stuff. I think we're very much on the same page about some of it. And I'll tell you, so although one of the approaches that I've taken in my lab is to try to get people to feel closer to their future selves, that's not the only way to go about staying focused on these sorts of goals. So I think one of the insights that Fishbach has really contributed, which I think is it's really
that's
important.
So awesome that you know Ayelet's work as well. Obviously, I knew you probably would know Hal's work, but yeah, this is the interconnectedness is always great when I land these connections on the show.
There's really neat intersections, right? I guess the social psychologists of the world are all a bit of an inbred group in some ways.
I could have a social psychologist on the show every week, because to me it's just fascinating, because like I kind of said before, I think is that coming from what I do as an advisor, but also as a parent as well, there's so many. I think when somebody thinks of a financial advisor, they think strictly of somebody that deals with numbers, picking stocks. That's it. But as I stress to people, what I do as a financial planner, it's more emotional than it is financial.
Yeah. And I think that's understanding right? The way that our emotions and the way that our cognitive biases can create pitfalls for ourselves, right?
Yes.
Is just so useful. I teach a course on applied social psychology, and one of the topics I cover is motivation. And I have the little subtitle for the lecture, something like getting out of your own way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically just figuring out the things that you do that essentially shoot yourself in the foot.
Yes.
And so I think one of the things, just to build on those insights about that medium term, one thing that's pretty neat there is that sometimes it's actually, rather than fighting our tendency to focus on the present and not on the future, sometimes it makes sense to just lean into that tendency, right? But to recast our mindset in a way that really focuses on why the things that are going to be good for us in the long term are also going to be good for us in the short term, right? So why it is that that can actually be beneficial to do these things today as well. This is one of the things that I think probably was the biggest insight for myself in shifting my own relationship with exercise. So for me, exercise used to always be like, this is something I ought to do for the long term, right? For my future self. And short-term barriers always kept getting in the way. Biggest one for me is I'm too busy, right? It's not that I didn't like doing it, but there's always something else that is more pressing.
Especially as a parent.
Yeah, especially as a parent, right? And working full time and all kinds of things going on, right? And so the shift for me was to stop thinking about exercise as something I was doing for my long-term self, but to start thinking about it as something I was doing for myself today and in the near future. Because it turns out there are all kinds of short-term benefits to exercise. Right. So you tend to have better mood. It's great for stress relief. It tends to improve your concentration. It can be fun. It's something you can do with your kids. It can, various things like that. It helps you to sleep better. It helps you to concentrate more. So all of these sorts of things are actually things that are going to be beneficial for me today. And in fact, can even answer some of the questions of those barriers, right? So if I think, well, I don't have time to exercise, I can reply to myself with, actually, I'm going to be, more energetic and concentrate better. So I'll get my work done more quickly. So that solves the time problem, right? So thinking about those ways that the psychological barriers that we set up for ourselves can also get circumvented is really useful. It can actually have some nice, actual actionable sorts of strategies.
Having you go through that example actually made me think of another social researcher, Katie Milkman, who I'm sure you're probably familiar with. And I think about back to her book that she wrote about, she gave this example, of exercising, like the person she was studying, he could only, he loved to watch Netflix, but he could only watch Netflix when he was like on his like bicycle or something. And he had his iPad hooked up to where it wouldn't turn on until he started pedaling. And I just think of that. Those things are great examples. And I don't know how I necessarily feel about the term life hacks, but I guess whatever connection you can make to better yourself, call it whatever you will. Obviously, it's the way to go. There is one topic I want to get to before I have to let you go. Is one area that we haven't talked about is how do your work does or doesn't integrate with people like ourselves that are parents. Are there specific things that you've researched that may be beneficial for parents to know about or think about or consider?
That's a great question, and not one I've thought a lot about. So I'm not a developmental psychologist, and I don't study parenting specifically. But I think that a lot of the insights that come from just managing identity and also our relationships are probably relevant in a lot of ways. So one way of thinking about it, I guess, is that some of these insights that can help us to feel better about ourselves, to stay motivated and that sort of thing, are also things that we can work in pretty natural ways into discussions with our kids, right? So kids are kind of like little mini scientists, and they're trying to figure out the world as they go along.
Especially the teenagers.
Especially the teenagers. But, this is something that happens from a very early age. They might not be talking in scientific language, but they're testing out things. They're seeing how parents are going to react. We're responding to our kids' successes and failures in various ways, right? And that gives them some clues about how they ought to react and what it might mean about their future and that sort of thing, right? So, so one insight that I could pull from Carol Dweck's work, who you might also know,
yes,
is that a lot of these ideas about selves over time really also come down to whether or not we feel that we are fundamentally able to change, or if we're somehow kind of born a certain way and static in our abilities, right? And so Dweck has talked about mindsets, how sometimes we can have a fixed mindset, like we're born with a certain amount of intelligence and that's just what we've got, or a growth mindset, which is, we can always continue to develop, to learn more, to grow more, and there's nothing really limited in our potential or our capacity. And so the way that we respond to our kids can really end up helping them to develop different kinds of mindsets. For example, when they experience failure, sometimes parents might want to protect our kids, right, from painful things, from harms, that sort of thing. And of course, we should protect them from serious harms, but we shouldn't protect them from failures, because those are really important, right, to learn how to navigate failures and the bumps along the way, and to understand that, actually, this is really important information for me, right? Because now I actually have more input into, this didn't work, right? This failure means that this strategy didn't work, or maybe I have to put in more effort, or I have to try things differently, or I have to get some help to learn something in a different way. But this is an opportunity for me to learn something new and to try a new strategy. So reframing things in ways that allow kids to, put those failures, keep them in the past, right? Those failures don't predict failure in the future,
right?
But rather they help us to learn different ways to go about things next time.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the unique challenges with kids is not allowing them to, or I should say, helping to not allow them to basically take a failure and extrapolate it into the future. I know that's something that Teresa and I, we work with our kids all the time, and we reference Carol. I don't know if Teresa knows who Carol Dweck is, but I certainly do, and have wanted her to have a conversation with her. But we are very aware of that growth versus fixed mindset, and it's something that we try as parents to really instill in our kids, is that growth mindset. And I think the word you use, malleable. Well, this has been a tremendous conversation, and it's a lot of this. The thing is, I love having people on like you that give, concrete, actionable items. I think one of the things I wrote down was this, write a letter to your future self and then back to your present self. I think that one's a great one. But I'll close with the closing question I ask all of my guests, which is, what is the best thing about being a parent?
One of the things that I love most, especially at the age and stage that my kids are, so I have a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, both boys, they're so different from one another, and they're also so different from either of their parents in such a way that it gives me a lot of humility as a parent. It makes me realize that I can do my best, but to some extent they're going to grow into the wonderful, unique individuals that they are, right? And I can really take so much credit for that. My 19-year-old is a really talented singer-songwriter, and he's got a couple of albums out on Spotify. Cole Allen, if you want to.
I was going to say, we will need to link that in our show notes. Cole Allen.
Cole Allen, yeah. He's got a different last name from me. And neither my husband or I can barely carry a tune, right? So although we've tried to connect him with people who can help him to develop those skills, it's definitely not from either of us. My 16-year-old is just absolutely loves team sports and is so great with just like, the social connection and the coordination and all that kind of stuff. And neither my husband or I, even though we like physical activity, we're definitely not team sports people. I'm barely coordinated enough to walk through a room half the time. And so these are just things that they discovered on their own. And as parents, we can help to support those things, but also to just, recognize that we're not making mini-me's, but we're making we're helping individuals to find themselves.
Well, that I think is a wonderful place to close. I think this first conversation with you, Anne, because I feel many more to come in our future. So, Anne Wilson, thank you so much for being on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast.
That was great. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. Please visit tamacapital.com to subscribe to this podcast or to connect with certified financial planner and registered investment advisor Paul Fenner of Tama Capital. And please join us again next time on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast.